So I'm going to have two stories, and the first one actually delves into a lot of the same territory as far as galaxies go as Dimitri's last story. But this one was a news story that you might have seen about most habitable galaxies. And the title of the paper is, as you see there, by Pratika Dayal, who is the lead author. But if you look at the press, the person that they usually quote is Anupam Mazumdar. But this is the paper that I'll be referencing. But if you look in the paper, you'll find that the question that they are interested in asking is which type of galaxy is most habitable in terms of complex life in the universe. And this is kind of an interesting question, just because, for the most part, when you hear about astronomers talking about life elsewhere in the universe, they talk about life around other stars in our galaxy, since we are finding more and more planets around nearby stars, almost about 2,000 now. And so this whole idea of astrobiology, a term that you also might have heard of, which is the study of the conditions of life elsewhere in our immediate universe. So usually that is meant other stars that are nearby, astral meaning stars. But in this case, the person that's often quoted in the press, Mazumdar, he talks in this paper about what he calls cosmobiology. So biology in the context of the entire universe, as opposed to just the stars. And so what they hope to figure out in this paper is to determine what galaxies are the most habitable, meaning the conditions in those galaxies are ripe or perhaps even riper than our own galaxy for planets to exist. And if you have lots of planets, perhaps you can have the conditions for life as well. And I'll jump right to the conclusion, which is the most habitable galaxy perhaps is this one, which doesn't look like very much. It's a galaxy called Maffei 1, and it was discovered in the late 60s by an Italian astronomer named Maffei, and so hence its name. And it's about 9 million light years away, and this is it's an elliptical galaxy, and so you can see sort of a roughly elliptical shape to it. But notice all these other stars. These are actually all stars inside our own galaxy. This galaxy happens to be in the constellation of Cassiopeia, which is very close to the galactic plane. And so we are actually looking through a lot of the gas and dust, basically sort of like the haze in our galaxy, in order to see this. And in fact, this particular galaxy was discovered in the near infrared. And so it's actually very difficult to see in the optical part of the wavelengths. And so it's very well hidden. It wasn't known until very recently, just a few decades ago. But if it wasn't occluded, it would take the size of this galaxy would be about 3/4 the size of our moon. So it would be very, very visible, except for the fact that our own galaxy, the Milky Way, is in its way. But what the results of this paper are is that a galaxy like this has the conditions that make it more habitable than our own galaxy. Now, this doesn't mean that there actually are more habitable planets, but chances are there probably are. So let's talk about what the thinking is behind the conclusions in this paper. And I want to talk about, here's another example of an elliptical galaxy. This is a much more famous one, M87. This is one of the largest ellipticals that we know of. Again, notice it has sort of a very roundish shape, hence the name elliptical. It also, elliptical galaxies are also, whoops, let's go back, noted by the fact that the stars, so this glow that you're seeing is from all the stars in this galaxy, but notice that the stars tend to be somewhat reddish. There's also a jet that's coming out of this galaxy originating from the central supermassive black hole. And in contrast, there are also spiral galaxies, or Milky Way is a barred spiral, but here is a spiral galaxy which has a center that looks sort of roundish like an elliptical, but what distinguishes spirals from ellipticals are the spiral arms. And what you'll notice in the spiral arms is that there are lots of gas and dust clouds, these dark lanes in the arms, and also associated with the arms are these bright bluish points, which look like stars, but these are actually regions where lots of stars are being formed. And so massive young stars look bluish, and because there are lots of massive young stars being formed in these star-forming regions, which are associated with these gas clouds, the overall color of a spiral galaxy tends to be bluer than an elliptical galaxy. So an elliptical galaxy doesn't have very many young stars. All the stars tend to be redder and hence older, whereas you have a mix of both older reddish stars throughout the spiral, but then you also have these bright blue giant stars that are relatively young. Now, galaxy evolution is something that astronomers have long been interested in because we can see lots of different types of galaxies, different types of ellipticals, different types of spirals. But the question is, how do galaxies evolve over time? And what astronomers have realized in recent decades is that this evolution occurs via mergers. And so we see lots of examples of interacting galaxies. Dimitri talked briefly about this as well. But it's when galaxies merge via their mutual gravity, they can combine and into one larger galaxy from the merger of two smaller galaxies. And in these mergers, the gas clouds can actually get compressed to form more stars. And oftentimes, like in this galaxy here, it's probably been through multiple the two individual galaxies have orbited each other multiple times, and it has caused great explosions in star formation, and hence you see lots of bright bluish stars. Here, this looks like a pair of galaxies, spiral galaxies that have just started passing through each other for the first time. And here is a scenario for what happens for in a merger. So you have two spiral galaxies merging, and after they've merged together, the disks in this case have also merged, but the central parts of those two spiral galaxies are still coalescing, and eventually the two supermassive black holes also merge. And what happens is after the black holes merge, and there's also a lot of gas that gets driven towards the center, and so this gas falls towards the black holes. The gas gets jammed up and gets heated to millions of degrees, and as a result, the central black hole, even though stuff can fall into the very center of the black hole, a lot of that gas, because it's superheated, gets ejected. And so you have a jet coming out, very similar to the jet that we saw in M87. And this jet can actually sweep out material. So it doesn't really affect the stars, but it can push out a lot of the gas that's in the galaxy. And so what's left behind is basically an elliptical. And what you'll notice when we looked at the elliptical is that you also hardly see any gas clouds at all. So these elliptical galaxies, not only are the stars older, but they don't have the same gas clouds that you find in spiral galaxies. And so we think that, based on both observations and based on theoretical calculations and computer simulations, that we have a pretty good idea of how galaxies evolve through these mergers, and how spiral galaxies with lots of young stars and with lots of gas and dust can evolve and turn into elliptical galaxies, which can be much bigger, but they tend to be older stars with very little star formation and no gas and dust. All right, I'm going to jump and talk about a slightly different topic in that you'll often hear astronomers talking about metals, and when they say metals, they don't mean necessarily things like aluminum or iron or nickel, but in astronomy, metals are associated with basically every single element in the periodic table except for hydrogen and helium. And that's because hydrogen and helium were the dominant elements that came out of the Big Bang. There were a few handful of other elements, but they were minuscule amounts. And basically everything else in the periodic table originated in stars, either in supernovas or were generated via fusion in smaller mass stars. And so one of the things that happens as a galaxy evolves, and this is a sort of a schematic of the processes that take place in a spiral galaxy. So you have the giant molecular clouds that I pointed out earlier. Those form stars, and oftentimes you have low mass stars as well as high mass stars, these massive stars. And it's the massive stars that blow up in supernova. And so these stars basically return a metal-enriched gas back into the interstellar medium, either via explosions or via stellar winds. And some of that gas falls back and accumulates into molecular clouds to form the next generation of stars. And so as you look at stars and galaxies that are older, what you'll find is that they tend to accumulate more and more so-called metals, meaning elements that are heavier than hydrogen and helium. And at the same time, you also have gas that's fallen in from elsewhere in the universe because galaxies have gravity and they're pulling in extragalactic gas. And then finally, for galaxies, and every galaxy that we've observed carefully has a supermassive black hole. And so these supermassive black holes can also eject gas away from the galaxy via the mechanisms that I mentioned earlier. And so galaxies have both outflows, meaning gas that's being ejected out from supernova, from black holes, as well as infalls, where gravity's pulling in matter from the extragalactic medium. And so that is an important point to remember. And then finally, let's start talking about habitable zones. For people who've come to many 60 Minutes in Space programs, we've talked about habitable zones around other stars. And habitable zone around a star is basically the region in which a planet is orbiting where it's neither too close and too hot, nor too far away or too cold for liquid water to exist on the surfaces of rocky planets. And so for a sun-like star, it turns out that our Earth orbits right in the middle of the habitable zone. And for a more massive star, that habitable zone has to be further away in order for the water not to be boiled off the surface. And for a cooler star, a redder star than our sun, the corresponding habitable zone has to be closer in than our own habitable zone. And people have talked about not only habitable zones around stars, but also in galaxies. And so there's been actually a lot of interesting work that has been done in the last decade or so. This is from a paper by Charles Lineweaver that was published about 10 years ago. And what the idea that they came up with was that for there are places in the galaxy that are propitious for creating planets. Well, first of all, you need to have lots of heavy elements to create planets. So you can't just have hydrogen and helium. You need to have elements heavier than that to create Earth-like planets. And in order to, for those heavy elements to be created, you need supernova, or so you need multiple generations of stars. But at the same time, you can't have too many supernova, because if you have lots of supernova, then there are chances, there's a probability that the supernova will wipe out any life that might have evolved on that planet. And so they basically came up with different regions in the galaxy where they identified places where it's too dangerous for life-bearing planets to exist, meaning there are too many supernova, regions where the conditions are just right, so not too many supernova for it to be dangerous, but just enough to create the heavy elements. And then finally, in the outer parts of the galaxy where there haven't been enough supernova, and so there aren't enough metals to form lots of planets. And we'll see. Well, this is unfortunately the only animation that works for tonight. But this is an animated GIF showing their simulation of how, over time, over billions of years, different regions of the galaxy will become more habitable. So initially, you'll see that the galaxy is only the inner region is red, but over time, the mid region, the mid plane, gets greener and greener. And so that was basically the results of their paper. And so that brings us to one other final topic before we jump to the conclusions. And this has to do with an idea called the fundamental metallicity relationship. And basically what this is Dimitri mentioned the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, one of these surveys of literally hundreds of thousands to millions of galaxies. And one of the things that cosmologists have realized by studying lots and lots of galaxies on these surveys is that you can come up with relationships between these different galaxies. And one of the relationships has to do with the mass of the galaxy, the amount of star formation in that galaxy, and finally the amount of metals of that galaxy. And when you investigate about 140,000 galaxies from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, what they found was that when you plotted these galaxies based on those three different parameters, they all followed this three-dimensional plane. So what we're seeing is a three-dimensional plot, and there is this twisted plane, and most galaxies basically, based on their metals, their mass, and the amount of star formation, will lie on that plane, on this plane. And the colors here represent the amount of metals, so that the red up on the top are galaxies with more metals, more elements heavier than hydrogen and helium, and the galaxies at the bottom in the blue are ones with fewest metals. And what's interesting about not only the survey results, the astronomers have also gone and done a lot of theoretical work and computer simulations. And what they show is that this sort of relationship between those three parameters sort of falls out based on the evolution and the history of a galaxy. So if you understand the infalls that are taking place, the gas that's falling into the galaxy, the gas that's being ejected by supernova and by the central black holes, and basically the entire evolution of the galaxy is folded into this diagram, so that the location of, let's say, our Milky Way in this diagram reflects the evolution of the Milky Way via those processes that we talked about earlier. So basically what the authors of this Galaxy Habitability paper did was they took all the ideas that I mentioned in the last 10-15 minutes or so, and they combined it with the probability of a terrestrial planet that you might find in a galaxy, depending on the metallicity, and they used that this probability on our observations of planets around other stars in our own galaxy. So we tend to find stars that have more metals. You tend to find more planets around. So there's definitely a probability for terrestrial planets as well as gas giant planets. And then finally, they also included a probability that that the planet, once formed, won't get irradiated so much by a supernova that all life is extinguished. And the result that they have is basically this very colorful plot. And this will take a little bit a minute for me to explain, but basically what this is showing is a plot of all galaxies based on their mass, and this is logarithmic, so our Milky Way would be somewhere around 9.5 or so. And along the side is the amount of star formation in that galaxy. So galaxies that have the most star formation are up here, the least star formation is up down here, and our Milky Way is scaled to be about 0. So our Milky Way is roughly about here. And what this is saying, and also there's also a color scale, and what this color scale is showing is the light blue colors down up at the top correspond to galaxies that have about 100 times more habitable terrestrial planets, Earth-like planets, than our own galaxy. And at the other end of the color scale, in the yellows, these are galaxies that have 100 million times less Earth-like planets than our own Milky Way. So what this is saying is that for small galaxies, so larger galaxies are at this end, smaller galaxies are at this end, smaller galaxies tend to have fewer habitable planets. And that comes because the smaller galaxies tend to have more star formation, and that star formation, along with the active galactic black holes, tends to drive out a lot of the metal-rich gas. And so that's why small galaxies with lots of star formation up here will have very few terrestrial planets, whereas if you look at large galaxies, like the large ellipticals, that have very little star formation, they tend to have lots more planets. So the galaxies here are in the light blue part of the scale. So this is for terrestrial planets. You can also come up with a similar plot for giant planets. And in this case, the giant planets are probably not habitable, but moons around a giant planet would be. And so, the light blue region here, these giant elliptical galaxies would have a million times more giant planets than our own Milky Way. And then at the other end of the scale, the galaxies in the yellow part of the plot would have 100 million times fewer giant planets than our own Milky Way. And so the conclusion, and the reason why I showed the MAF-A1 galaxy is that compared to the Milky Way, for galaxies that are about twice the mass of our own galaxy, and MAF-A1 is a galaxy that's about twice the mass, and about 1/10 the star formation rate, you would expect to find about 10,000 times more Earth-like planets and 1,000,000 times more gas giant-like planets. So this is what the authors mean when they say they wanted to investigate the what the most habitable galaxies are, and it turns out that our Milky Way is not the most habitable. You'd have to go to a galaxy that is much larger, had seen more star formation, and so has had more metals, but currently doesn't have very much star formation so that those metals can form planets.